My guest today is Professor Sir Simon Baron-Cohen, who is a professor of psychology and psychiatry at the University of Cambridge. He is also the director of the Autism Research Center in Cambridge. His latest book is The Pattern Seekers. Welcome, Simon.
Thank you very much. Looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. So, we are going to talk about autism. Well, something we used to call autism, sort of a binary issue. You
Hmm.
have it or you don't have it. And then we moved to an autism spectrum disorder designation, saying things are sort of on a spectrum. It's not necessarily binary. But you are arguing here it is not really even a disorder to some extent. So it's an autism spectrum condition, and we will talk more about that. So I want to jump into chapter 3 of your book, The Pattern Seekers, which is about 5 types of brain. I found the book fascinating, Simon. So you
Thank you.
talk about 5 types of brain. Could you talk a bit about that? How do we characterize these 5 types?
Sure. Um, so I developed a theory. It's actually now about 20 years old, but I elaborated in my recent book. But the theory is that two important dimensions in the human mind, one is empathy, and the other one is what I call systemizing. So we can talk about each one and then how they map onto these five different profiles.
Yeah.
So empathy is a word in English. We're familiar with the word, and it involves being able to put yourself into the shoes of another person, to imagine their thoughts and feelings. But I call it a dimension because we vary in how much empathy we have. Some people are very high in empathy, other people very low, most of us in the middle. So there are individual differences, and that's the kind of key point. The other dimension I call systemizing. So that's the drive to analyze or build a system, where a system is something that follows rules or laws. And when you're trying to understand a system, really you're trying to identify the rules that govern the system so you can predict how it works. Could be any kind of system, could be a mechanical system, it could be a mathematical system, a musical system, a natural system like the weather. There are so many different systems out there. But again, it's on a dimension. Some people systemize a lot, and other people are not very interested in systems. And again, most of us are somewhere in the middle.
Mm.
So, you're familiar with the concept of a bell curve, and there are bell curves in empathy and in systemizing. So back to your question about five different types of brains, some people lean more towards the world of people and empathy and are less interested in systems. So I call that type E. And some people are more interested in systems, less interested in people. So I call that type S for systemizing. A third brain type is type B for balanced. So these are individuals who are equally interested in people or in things. And then you get the extremes of these types. So an extreme of type E is someone who is so focused on other people's thoughts and feelings, they do it all the time. They can't really switch off from empathy. And an extreme of type S are people who are so fascinated in systems.
Mm.
They look for systems everywhere, patterns in the world, and they're constantly trying to spot patterns to understand if these are lawful regularities that will help us understand how the world works.
So this
Yeah.
is so sorry to interrupt, Simon. So there's a two-dimensional matrix. So you have what you call SQ on the x-axis. So this is systemizing,
Yeah.
and EQ on the y-axis. That's the empathy
Mhm.
axis.
Yeah.
And you developed a tool that not precise, but in 10 questions will tell you where you might be. on these two dimensions. I did that, Simon,
Okay.
and it really surprised me. Yeah, I came out right in the middle of the B type,
Okay.
and that was surprising to me because I spent most of my career in quantitative fields. So I did quite a
Yeah.
bit of engineering, quite a bit of finance,
Yeah.
artificial intelligence, quantitative fields all my life.
Right. Okay.
So I would have thought I would be more systemizing,
Yeah.
but I came out right in the middle, which is just a
Yeah.
surprise. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we've only just met, so I don't know a lot about you and how you spend your time, but even just the idea that you've created a podcast suggests that you like to communicate, that you're interested in people, not just science, the science of the physical world. You're also interested in people and the sharing ideas, trying to find out what other people are interested in. So to me, it's not a big surprise that you're type B, but you mentioned the questionnaires of
Yeah.
how we measure these things, and the short versions of these questionnaires have 10 items each. So we use these very short versions just to give people a quick way to estimate where they lie on these two dimensions. The full versions of these questionnaires have many more items, so they're probably a bit more sensitive to, sensitivity, to accuracy, and to reliability.
So if you take the aggregate population, what is sort of the rough percentages in these five categories?
Okay. So what we find, first of all, controversially, is that there are gender differences,
Mm.
that more women than men show a profile of type E, where they're more interested in empathy than in systems. It's about 40% of women. And almost the mirror opposite, more men than women showed the profile of type S, where they're more interested in systems than in people. Um, and again, just referring to those two profiles, it's about 40% of women type E, 20% of men. And for systemizing it, or type S, it's 40% of males and only 20% of females.
Mhm.
And then the remainder are either in the middle, that type B, where you fall,
Yeah.
or, you know, at the tails of the distribution, at the
Mhm.
extremes, we see maybe about 5% at each end of the distribution. So people who are extreme. And what's interesting for me is that autistic people, this goes back to the beginning of our conversation, autistic people are much more likely, whether they're male or female, they're much more likely to be type S,
Mhm.
focused on systems, or even extreme type S, where they're searching for patterns all the time. The reason I mention patterns, it's not just in the title of my book, The Pattern Seekers, is that when you systemize, you're looking for these regularities. I call them if and then
Mhm.
patterns. If I take something and I do something to it, then I get a particular outcome. Autistic people seem to have a particular attraction to looking for these patterns wherever they might be. Could be
Yeah.
in music, could be in mathematics, could be in coding,
Coding,
computer
I was
science.
thinking computer programming, if and then
Yeah,
type things there. And I was thinking, Simon, so evolutionarily, there has to be
mm,
some basis for it, right? I mean, we obviously can get data on it, but intuitively, it makes a lot of sense. Let's say men went out to hunt. That is a very much process-driven thing, and you have to sort of systematize that whole thing to get the good output from it.
yeah, yeah,
And possibly women spend time at home or in the cave at that time, Homo sapiens, let's say 300,000 years ago,
sure.
and spend more time with kids and people. So this might be just a sort of an evolutionary driver.
Yeah, Yeah,
that
I mean,
what's here.
I
Yeah.
think I think you're right that we are speculating about how Homo sapiens lived 100,000 years ago or longer than that. Was there a division of roles between the genders? Um, it's likely that women played the larger role in childcare and in creating the community, the social networks. Um, and you need empathy
Mhm.
for raising children. You know, Children are not systems that you can program, as any
They're
parent.
tough to bring up. They're very difficult.
Yeah, and they're not predictable. It's not like a machine. Any parent will tell you that you have to use, you know, um, your empathy in the sense of being tuned into what does your child need, what does your child want. Might your child be unhappy about something? So really, like keeping their emotions at the forefront of your attention. Whereas, as you say, with hunting, it's much more. You called it process driven, but you need tools, and tools are, you know, they need to be created or made. Whether you're talking about a bow and arrow, which is a complex tool,
Mhm.
um, but they are like machines, and you can vary the length of the bow and arrow, the tension in
Mhm.
the cord or the fiber, the kind of arrowhead you have. There's so many different variables in the system that will make the tool more or less efficient. That's just one example.
Yeah. So this asymmetry that we see between men and women, type E and type S. Do we have any data on, sort of cultural differences? Let's say, so I grew up in India,
Right.
and I quite see what you mean. The engineering school I went to had 247 men and 3 women. And this was 30 years ago, and things
Right.
have changed. So there is a sort of a longitudinal aspect to this too, right? So things are changing on
Yeah.
that dimension as well. So 2 questions: culturally,
Yeah.
do we see a difference, and longitudinally, do we see a change in this pattern?
Right. These are great questions, and you know, I wouldn't expect any aspect of human behavior to be 100% biologically determined. Culture plays a very important part in most aspects of human behavior, including things like empathy or systemizing. Because otherwise, why would we send our children to school? If there was no role for learning and for experience and cultural factors, then we wouldn't bother. We would just assume that children are on some genetic program, and however they're going to turn out is entirely the result of their genes.
Mhm.
That's not the way human behavior works. So, back to your question, is there any data on this? People have translated those questionnaires we talked about, the empathy quotient, the systemizing quotient, and they have largely documented the same gender differences in different cultures, which is quite interesting. So even if there's a cultural component, there might also be some what you called evolved
Mhm.
element to these things. Um, I suppose a second factor about this is well, we've done big online studies where people participate from all over the world because it's the internet.
Mhm.
Um, and when we've tried to look for the role of culture, we haven't found strong cultural effects. Um, but yeah, I think there. Maybe a third way of answering your question is that when it comes to subjects like STEM,
Yeah.
science, technology, engineering, and maths, um, engineering and mathematics are still about 75% male at
Mhm.
university. So by the time you get to university level, I work in a university, and universities are constantly trying to find more women to work in engineering, mathematics, computer science. So I don't know that it's cultural factors that are holding back women. from applying in the same numbers, the same proportions as men. I think it may reflect interests.
Hmm.
Do you really want to spend all day trying to solve a maths problem? And I don't think it's about a difference in aptitude
Hmm.
or ability, because in my university, and it's true in many, more women than men apply for medicine. So
Hmm.
medicine involves good scientific aptitude, but in that subject, it's an example where the person wants to use their scientific ability to
Yeah.
help people. So it's that balance again between, good systemizing, good scientific ability, but
Yeah.
also, in medicine, it's good empathy too.
Hmm. Yeah, so it's interesting. So medicine is much more balanced in the US as well in terms of numbers, men and women. And I don't have a lot of data on this, but my general feeling is that my daughter is at OBGYN, and she was, going through a residency program. She was originally interested in research, and now she's only interested in practice. And so there's a little bit of a difference there too. Even after going into medicine, you might find an asymmetry between women opting to practice and men sort of sticking with life sciences research or something like that. I haven't seen any
Mm.
data on it, but it's possible, I guess.
Yeah, and your earlier point was there could be change over time,
Yeah.
because attitudes change in a good way. Most societies are becoming more progressive and more liberal, and so there might have been stigma towards men going into certain professions in the past, or men being very hands-on as parents,
Mm.
and all of that, thankfully, is changing towards equality. Um, so I think we have to distinguish between, if you like, our politics. What kind of world would we like? And for me, it would be where there is gender equality in everything.
Mm.
But we have to separate that or distinguish our politics from what actually happens in reality.
Mm.
You know, Males and females can apply for any subject in universities, but why is it that we see these trends of more males going for mathematics, more females going for medicine? These are just interesting questions. Yeah,
Yeah. So talk a little bit about autism and autism
sure.
spectrum condition. Uh,
Okay.
and so we already sort of established that we have this extreme S, people who love systemizing everything. They love machines, they love programming, computers, things you can, let me call it, a little bit easier to work with than people, uh,
I mean, it's not
potentially.
that, I mean, sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
It's not that one is easier,
Yeah.
because some people find, interacting with people really easy.
Mm.
And some people would find computer programming really difficult. And
Mm.
then there are other people who have the opposite profile. And that's what I find fascinating. This is part of diversity.
Yeah.
I know that we're not allowed to use this word under the new regime in the US,
Yes.
but it's part of what we call neurodiversity,
Mm.
that there are many different kinds of brains in the environment.
Yeah.
Autistic people you've mentioned tend to be at one extreme, but it's not always that they're using their good systemizing in STEM subjects. They might be artists, they might be
Mm.
chefs, they might be knitting. All of these things still have patterns.
Yeah.
When you follow a knitting pattern, it's literally the word. It's
Mm.
because there's repetition and there's a sequence and there's a kind of a logic to it. Um, the same with cooking,
Yeah.
that when you follow a recipe, it's a bit like a computer program, but it's in a much more domestic context.
So the common factor, Simon, is it focus? So is it true that extreme S folks tend to focus on a few things? So they want to really sort of dive deep,
Mm.
And but I don't know. I don't have any data. I'm speculating here. On the other end of this, I wonder more empathy-related people. Are they more broad? In other words,
Yeah,
are they going across different subjects, different people, different cultures, and they're not really
yeah,
diving deep into anything? Do we find a
yeah,
pattern like that?
yeah. So let's bring autistic people back into the conversation, because often they are systemizers, even strong systemizers. But autistic people have excellent attention to detail. For them, the details matter. And obviously, in subjects like mathematics, every number is important
Mhm.
in a, in a sequence, because if you change one number, it changes the whole equation. You know, the same in programming. Every detail is important, otherwise the program doesn't run. So, um, so I think you're right that systemizers, they tend to focus on detail. When it comes to people who are better at empathy, it is more about the big picture. Because when you empathize with someone, you're paying attention to their facial expressions, but also you're paying attention to their tone of voice, to the context of what's just happened in their backstory, and maybe where you are in the conversation. So there's so many different um, sort of aspects to inferring what someone else might be thinking or feeling. But
Mhm.
it is big. It is much more. In psychology, it's sometimes called global versus local processing.
Mhm.
That when we socialize, when we try to interact with people, we have to be much more at the global level.
Mhm.
If we get too hung up on small details, we'll miss the flow of the conversation,
Yeah.
Whereas in the case of systems thinking, it's actually an advantage to get stuck on details because then you really fine tune the system.
Mhm. So do we see any brain structure differences between these two? But the reason I'm asking is my intuition is that if you are high EQ, when you have conversations, when you are communicating, you are taking in a lot more information in the sense that, as you say, facial expressions,
Yeah,
there's a lot more information coming to you,
yeah,
and the brain has to process it. Whereas on the other side, it's a sort of a different type of information. It's almost like
yeah,
analog. I'm just making this up, Simon. I have no clue. It's almost like analog versus digital.
yeah,
On one side you are counting zeros and ones. On the other side, it's sort of
yeah,
analog. Do we
yeah,
see it?
yeah. I mean, it's a good metaphor, that systemizers, are much more digital and empathizers are more analog. Um, it is just a metaphor, but it does convey the idea that there's almost different operating systems underlying each of these styles of processing information. I mean, you're asking, I think, about MRI studies. Is there a difference in the brain?
Yeah.
And scientists are starting to look at this. So there have been some small scale studies suggesting type E, the empathizers, show differences in brain structure and function compared to type S. But they're about 10 years old when studies were quite small scale. These days we live in the age of big data. So there's research underway, but I think it's likely that we'll see quite marked differences between these different types. I mean, people speculate about the regions of the brain, and empathy involves a whole network of regions, including the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the frontal part of the brain, the amygdala, which is in the subcortex, many different regions. Systemizing is beginning to be explored, and there's a part of the brain called the intraparietal sulcus, which
Mhm.
seems to be involved in this attention to detail and looking for regularities in the world. But I think the neuroscience still has a long way to go.
So if did I understand this correctly, Simon? So if you are empathetic, brain scans, I know these are old, we're getting more data, seems to imply more distributed processing. A lot of different parts of the brain gets involved, whereas in the other case, more concentrated. Is that the way to understand?
I think it's a reasonable hypothesis, but I think we need more research. Um, but certainly there's this idea that you can look at long range connections between the back and the front of the brain
Mm.
versus much more short range connections between adjacent parts of the brain. So that's another way to analyze or to test for differences, short versus long range connectivity.
Yeah, it's difficult to stretch it, but possibly as the technology improves, brain scans may be a way to position somebody in the spectrum.
You're right. I mean, this theory about empathy and systemizing started at a behavioral or psychological level, where you can map people onto those two dimensions. But you're right, as we get more MRI data and we can use machine learning, we might discover that there's an algorithm which predicts, are you more of an empathizer or more of a systemizer, purely based on information from the brain. We're not there yet, but it's, AI is moving very fast.
Yeah, this is just an opinion, Simon. The balance band in your diagram is probably the most boring place to be, uh, because as you push toward the corners, life gets very interesting for those people. When
Yeah,
you're balanced, you're sort of doing a plain vanilla
yeah.
thing.
What you might have imagined if you'd left it to natural selection, you might have imagined that the majority of the population would be balanced
Mm,
because there are advantages to being able to understand systems and there are advantages to being able to understand people. But actually, what the data shows us is most brains move in one direction or the other, either more towards systems or more towards people.
mm,
That brains seem to specialize. And, maybe that's because there are advantages to being good at one or good at the other. There are
mm,
more advantages. So if you're a people person, it may mean that you find communication easier, you find it easier to make friends and to network and to, I don't know, really rise in your social group
mm.
and flourish. If you're a systems person, again, it makes sense to kind of specialize in that and be as good as you can be, making the best tools or I don't know, tracking animals. That's systemizing, being the best hunter, or mapping the environment in different ways.
Mm.
But it's just an observation that maybe there are these niches, and different brains have evolved to occupy different niches.
Yeah, it's a good segue, Simon. You talk about this in the book. Newton, Einstein. I don't know if you talk about Maxwell. Maxwell is also sort of in the same vein, I think.
Yeah,
Um, these are people who changed the world
yeah.
almost single-handedly,
Hmm.
and you say they would have been autistic in many ways, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's not really my claim. Many people have speculated that some of our greatest scientists today might have received a diagnosis of autism,
Mm,
but just based on how they spent the majority of their time focused on understanding a system, might have been an aspect of physics. You're talking about people like Einstein or Newton, and also based on their behavior. Einstein didn't talk until he was 5 years old. Newton often got into conflict in his relationships, but these are people who made great contributions to the world of science.
mm,
Uh, we can also look at people alive today who are great inventors and scientists. So someone like Elon Musk has openly spoken about being autistic. Bill Gates recently in a documentary this year accepted that he's probably autistic.
mm,
But these are people who've innovated they've come up with inventions and fresh ways of looking at the world and pushing forward with scientific boundaries.
Mm.
Even if socially, some of, they may have struggled.
Mm. So the great leaps in science, technology, and other fields, the great leaps, so on the emotion side, I'm thinking, somebody like Mahatma Gandhi or somebody like that. Um, they also changed the world.
Yeah,
Uh, and so at the corners, I think you call them giants, maybe. At the
right,
corners of your spectrum, there are
right.
giants. You don't
Yeah,
find giants in the middle, typically.
yeah. No, no, it's very interesting. I like your example of Mahatma Gandhi. Because I don't know much about his life, but he cared about people enormously. And I think his behavior was governed by respect for other people, deep respect. Paradoxically, even respect for the British when he very politely said, it's time to leave. He wasn't using like anger or military approaches to the enemy. He was using empathy, but also good communication. Um, so I think you're proposing that perhaps he had extreme empathy. Is that right?
That's what I was
Um,
thinking. Yeah.
yeah. And we could take another giant, Nelson Mandela, in a different culture, but he had to have the vision to that the way forward was not to fight the enemy, but to understand the other community, the white population in South Africa. He made a relationship with de Klerk. It was based on respect, based on getting to know each other. So you need a lot of empathy for that. And it led to the end of apartheid. So changing the world, as you say.
Yeah. So I want to get into another topic, Simon. So there is a genetic component to it, right? So especially extreme S.
Right.
We can trace that back. It seems to run in families. And I don't know if you talk about this in the book. Do we find a similar thing on extreme E? My
So
intuition is
yeah,
not. Yeah.
it's a very good question. So on the genetics of systemizing, we investigated this. We had the opportunity to work with the company 23andMe, which is a personal genomics company. You pay $100, you send a saliva sample, and they tell you what genes you're carrying. But with the customers of that company, we also invited them to take the SQ, the systemizing quotient. So we were able to do a genome-wide association study.
Oh,
So
wow.
looking at the common genetic variants associated with systemizing. And then we did an interesting analysis because we looked to see was there any overlap or correlation with the common genetic variants of autism.
Mm.
And we found there was indeed a significant overlap or correlation. So it's not just so the interesting like take home message is not only that there's a genetic part to systemizing, it's not 100%, but the genes play a part, but also that some of the same genes involved in systemizing are also genes involved in autism. So it kind of changes our view of autism away from this idea of a disease or a disorder to also recognizing that autistic people have strengths, sometimes even talents in understanding patterns in the world, which could be very valuable in all kinds of walks of life.
And so in the 23andMe experiment, if you look at the EQ side, do we find anything different?
So so far, the genetics of empathy in terms of these genome-wide association studies haven't revealed as much of a genetic component. we think that there's probably still some genetics going on because if you look at twins, you know, identical twins versus non-identical twins,
Yep.
the identical twins have a more similar empathy profile to each other compared to non-identical twins. And obviously, identical twins share 100% of their genes, non-identical only 50% of their genes on average. So we've got clues that even empathy might have some genetic component, but it may be that you need very big data to see that signal.
And perhaps more genes are involved too, just intuitively.
Yeah. I mean, with all of these traits, they're not single gene traits. Um, you know, uh, multiple genes or parts of genes, they're called polymorphisms, which are kind of different versions of sequences within a gene that exist in the population. But if I could bring us back to this question that you started with of, is autism a disorder or a disease? I don't use those terms. I recognize that autism involves disability. We've talked a little bit about difficulties that autistic people may have in social relationships, in communication, and also in adjusting to unexpected change.
Mm.
They prefer predictability and get very stressed if things are unpredictable. But on the other side of autism, we've talked about excellent attention to detail,
Mm.
excellent pattern recognition, and this ability to focus on one topic in great depth. These things are not diseases or disorders. They're wonderful aspects of the human mind. So they're just differences. And that's why I prefer the word neurodiversity. You know, neurodiversity encompasses both disability and difference, but it's less stigmatizing than words like disorder.
Sorry, Simon, I had a little bit of a technical issue here. Sorry.
No
um,
problem.
so, so we talked about inventor. So it is. So there is a genetic component. I think you talked a little bit about testosterone. Is that we find some correlation when there is
Yeah,
high levels of testosterone, there is a higher level of S in people, right? And we see that in the men, women asymmetry. But just
yeah.
the quantity of testosterone is also seems like a predictor.
It does predict to some extent, but I should introduce one caveat, which is it's prenatal testosterone.
Prenatal,
So,
yeah.
yeah. So we've been able to measure these hormones, testosterone and estrogen. They're called the sex steroid hormones. We've been able to measure them during pregnancy, particularly in the amniotic fluid that surrounds the baby. And we do this when women have a clinical procedure called amniocentesis,
Mm.
where some of that fluid is taken for clinical reasons. We've asked the women if we can analyze it for their hormone levels. And we do find that uh, later, if you follow up the child, so longitudinal studies, the kids who had higher levels of prenatal testosterone, they have stronger systemizing, but also have more difficulties with empathy. So the same hormone seems to be involved in these different aspects of the mind, but in opposite directions.
Mm. I think I saw, I don't know if this is in your research, Simon, but there is also an effect of oxytocin. Is that the right pronunciation? Oxytocin. I
Yeah,
think
yeah,
there are some studies that shows possibly indicates that oxytocin could be used to reduce effects of extreme S. Um, the one side. So I want to get your perspective on this. So
yeah,
people with extreme S, some of them are immensely capable. We talked about Newton, Einstein, Bill Gates, and so on. But it is not a given, right? So there are
yeah,
people with that characteristic who struggle. They can't even get a job anywhere, right? So it
yeah.
is. it is a little bit of a struggle for, I would imagine, a large number of people in that category, right?
Yeah, yeah. I'm glad you mentioned this because so far we've talked about autism as if that's the single diagnosis that a person has. But actually, in reality, most autistic people have multiple diagnoses. So they might have dyslexia, they might have ADHD, they might have mental health conditions like depression or anxiety. In fact, it turns out most autistic people have 6 or 7 diagnoses. And and they might have co-occurring intellectual disability or language delay. So these things are not necessarily part of autism, but they go along with autism. They co-occur. And so when you talk about struggling, that many autistic people are having quite challenging lives. We need to identify, well, what is causing the challenges? If it's intellectual disability, that might limit their employment opportunities. Mental health, might make them very anxious about making friends or going to work. But also there could be social barriers too, such as stigma and discrimination. We know that autistic people often report victimization, that they've experienced being bullied when they were at school as kids. It damages their self-confidence, their self-esteem. And when they leave school and they try to apply for jobs, they may not get through the interviews because employers often are looking for social skills, looking for good communication skills. And these are the very areas in which they have disability. So there's a kind of discrimination built in to the hiring process. And if we were discriminating against any other minority, there would be an outcry. But in the case of autism, 80% of autistic adults are not in work, not in paid employment. So there's clear barriers and likely discrimination preventing them to getting into the world of work.
So that implies that early intervention is important in this case because
Yeah,
I'm a big believer in initial conditions.
yeah,
If your initial conditions are really bad, you get bullied at school, you don't have friends, and that's going to stay with you a
yeah,
lifetime. So early diagnosis man, is not the right term here because as you say, it's not necessarily a disorder. It is it is
well,
something that people should be thinking about. Sorry.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I think diagnosis is still appropriate as a word because you're diagnosing a disability. So I'm very clear in my opinion, that autism involves disability. And I think to deny that is almost taking away their opportunity for support because once you diagnose a disability, that makes the person eligible for extra support, whether it's at work or at school or for the family. You know, it's not just a disability, it's also a difference, including strengths and talents. But we shouldn't ignore the disability part. Um, I like your focus on initial conditions because if we can get the initial conditions, the early years, if we can get that right for autistic people, we might be able to prevent them from having years of misery. It's no fun being bullied. It's no fun experiencing exclusion. Many autistic people describe being called names when they were young. So it's like being shamed and humiliated. Um, maybe not being invited to other children's birthday parties. So a sense of what's wrong with me, feeling rejected. If we can sort of raise awareness. So I guess there's several different strands. Early diagnosis might mean that the child gets the right support much earlier, because some people currently don't get their diagnosis till their teens or even their adulthood. when all the damage has been done. Early diagnosis could mean the support is there early, ideally. And then if we can also kind of educate the peer group, educate society about how to be compassionate towards people who are different, instead of being hurtful and unkind towards people who are different, show some kindness and show some understanding and respect and acceptance of difference. This is all that autistic people are asking for. Very
Yeah.
basic humanity.
Yeah, I think you mentioned a company that hires only autistic people. What was
Um,
the name of that company?
there is one company called Auticon, which the name comes from autistic consultant, and they hire autistic people. They give them a job for life. Currently, they're focusing on autistic people who are good at coding, so they're working in the IT sector. But I think, any employer could be thinking, can I hire an autistic person? How can we shift the needle so that more autistic people are in the workplace? And of course, it requires reasonable adjustments or accommodations for the person. But if you give an autistic person a chance to show what they're capable of, you might be very surprised.
Yeah, so I know that you have to go, Simon. So I just want to finish up with this. So in the academic setting,
Yeah,
my intuition is that the percentage of extreme S would be high compared to a corporate environment or
mm,
something like that.
right.
And the stigma associated with that would also be low, right? Is that
Yeah,
what you find, or that's different?
yeah. I mean, in the academic setting, uh, you are valued if you specialize in a particular subject. Um, and autistic minds tend to prefer to specialize. They like to go into great depth. We talked about that. But they often, their minds are working like that even when they're children. Often autistic children, they latch onto one subject. They want to go as deep as they can to understand every different aspect of that subject. And they find it frustrating that the mainstream education system expects them to have a very broad education. Some kids would just love to do mathematics all day, or music all day,
Yeah.
or history all day. And so I think it's no surprise that when we look in universities, we find individuals who are strong at systemizing, enjoying understanding a system in great depth.
So this could be sort of an intervention in some ways. I'm just thinking about this, Simon. So early diagnosis, as you say, one intervention is the careers that they would be happiest at would be research, services, some sort of academic avenue, something along those lines. So if there is support, as you said, and
Yeah,
some sort
yeah,
of
yeah,
guidance, it's almost
yeah.
like career guidance that they need right from the beginning.
Yeah, but we may also have to make some quite radical changes to the high school system, because at the moment we expect all students to study 9 or 10 subjects up until they go to university. That doesn't really sort of play to the strengths of autistic people. Why not make a reasonable accommodation that if a person wants to specialize early, let them do that, because that could be their stepping stone into a successful life. Why do we insist that after 30 minutes you stop maths and you move to literature, and then after another 30 minutes you move to geography, and so forth? The typical lessons in the school day. They may work for the non-autistic mind, but they often cause unhappiness for autistic people.
Yeah, it's a fascinating book, Simon. Yeah, thanks for sending it to me. It is published, right?
It's
Patterns.
published. Yeah, it's published. The subtitle is How Autism Drives Invention, and I hope the book is in some ways a celebration of the important role that autistic people have played in human progress.
Yes. Excellent. Yeah, thanks so much for spending time with me.
I've enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.